So, was the cat in the hat black? And what on earth do I mean by that question? I mean, he's a cat, isn't he? Sure. He's a cartoon cat who walks upright, who wears a red and white striped top hat and a kind of garish bow tie and carries an umbrella, but he's a cat. Probably. Maybe. I'll answer my title question in a moment. But first, I should say that I've made the question, the title question, because, as Robin Bernstein has noted, racism sneaks into children's culture under the cloak of innocence, and once there, it continues to influence the broader culture. I've made this the title of the book because racial and racist images persist in the cultures of childhood, often in ways that we don't notice on a conscious level. This is why, in children's books and culture, race is present, especially when it seems to be absent. And Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat illuminates the ways in which images from the past continue to haunt the present, and apparently discarded racial ideas linger on. The Cat in the Hat is racially complicated, inspired by blackface caricature and by actual people of color. One story of the book's origins is that in 1955, William Spalding, director of Houghton Mifflin's educational division, thought that Dr. Seuss could solve the why Johnny can't read crisis by writing reading primers that children actually enjoyed reading, you know, instead of Dick and Jane, which children did not enjoy reading. So as Seuss rode the elevator up to Spalding's office, he noticed that the elevator operator was an elegant, petite African-American woman who wore white gloves and a secret smile. Her name was Annie Williams, and in response to Spalding's challenge, write me a story that first graders can't put down, Seuss wrote The Cat in the Hat, giving the protagonist, Mrs. Williams, white gloves, her sly smile, and her color. A source for the cat's red bow tie is Crazy Cat, the ambiguously gendered creation of biracial cartoonist George Herriman. Seuss also draws on the traditions of minstrelsy, an influence that emerges first in a minstrel show that he wrote and performed in blackface while in high school. In fact, blackface minstrelsy recurs in Seuss's early cartoons, in 20th century popular culture, and its traces linger on in many other icons of children's literature. As Robin Bernstein says, and I'm going to quote her here at length, children's culture has a special ability to preserve even as it distorts and transmit even as it fragments the blackface mask and styles of movement which persist not only in Raggedy Ann and the Scarecrow, but also in the faces and gloved hands of Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. And to her list, we can add Seuss's cat. And what makes the cat so interesting and so representative, and why he's the title of the book, is that during the very same decade that The Cat in the Hat was published, Seuss was both speaking out against racism and recycling racist caricature in his books. So in a 1952 essay, he pointedly critiques racist humor. In 1953, inspired by his opposition to anti-Semitism, he writes The Sneetches. And then, the same year as Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court case that ostensibly made school segregation illegal in the US, Horton Hears a Who presents the Who's smallness as an arbitrary mark of difference for which they are unfairly penalized. One review at the time said that Horton's refrain, "A person's a person, no matter how small," was, quote, a rhymed lesson in protection of minorities and their rights. And yet, in the same decade, in If I Ran the Zoo, Gerald McGrew proposes going to the African island of Yurka to bring back a tizzle-top tufted mazurka who sits on a perch, carried by two African men, and suggesting a kinship with animals. The two nearly naked Africans have tufts on their heads that resemble the tuft on the head of the birds. Their faces really seem to come straight out of Seuss's early cartoons. The same book offers a visit to the mountains of Zomba Matant with helpers who wear their eyes at a slant. Meanwhile, Scrambled Egg Super, also from the 50s, invites us to laugh at Ali, a gullible Arab being attacked by hundreds of angry Mount Struku cuckoos. Dr. Seuss's work is both racist and opposes racism, and does both in the same decade. These characters and the cat's minstrel ancestry reveal Seuss's racial unconscious, indicating how his imagination resuscitated and revised early 20th century and 19th century stereotypes. His career also reminds us that you don't need to be a Klansman or, say, Donald Trump to participate in white supremacy. Recognizing the Cat in the Hat's ancestry in both blackface performance and African American culture makes visible three ways in which American picture books have been a battleground in the fight against racism. First, just as recognizing how black voices shaped Huckleberry Finn, the book from which I stole my title, helps us to desegregate American literature, excuse me. So understanding how black voices and blackface created Seuss's The Cat in the Hat assists us in desegregating children's literature. Seuss's work is not only heir to the nonsense of Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear and Hilaire Belloc, it's also heir to that of E.W. Kemble in its stereotypes and Langston Hughes in opposing those same stereotypes. Second, in the 50s, American readers of children's literature saw animal characters as distinctly racialized. In fact, in both racist and anti-racist children's literature, differences between animals have had a long history of representing differences between and similarities among races. So in 1959, racist Southerners accused this book, Garth Williams' Rabbit's Wedding, of promoting integration and demanded that the book be removed from libraries. In the book, a white rabbit marries a black rabbit. This became a national news story at the time. The third reason for thinking about the cat's minstrel ancestry is that borrowing from American iconography, The Cat in the Hat and The Minstrel both dramatize the moral contradictions at the heart of the United States, a country founded both on slavery and, paradoxically, on the idea of freedom. As a response to the Why Johnny Can't Read crisis, the cat offered the hope that his exciting poetic narrative would make literacy available to all American children. But despite Brown versus Board of Education 3 years before, libraries remained segregated in most states. Black students did not have access to the same materials that white students had. So if the cat represents all American children's right to literacy, he also masks a separate but unequal educational system. He embodies the discrepancy between the ideals and the realities of America in the 1950s and today. Which is why Was the Cat in the Hat Black? Is the title of the book. But, and I'm sorry to disappoint here, the book is not only about Dr. Seuss. Really, only the first chapter focuses on Dr. Seuss. Each chapter of Was the Cat in the Hat Black addresses the often unseen ways in which racism persists in children's literature. Racism endures because racism is structural. It's embedded in culture, embedded in institutions. And my argument, and I'm not the first person to make this argument, is that one of the places that racism hides and one of the best places to oppose it is books for young people. What we learn as children shapes our worldview so profoundly because when we are small, we are still in the process of figuring out who we are and what we believe. For this reason, children's books, children's toys, and children's culture are some of the most important influences on who we become and on what biases we harbor or don't harbor. And so we need to ask hard questions and have uncomfortable conversations about the children's books and children's culture that we consume. And this will be upsetting for some people. Dr. Seuss Enterprises, for example, the corporate entity that oversees the licensing and production of all things Seuss, would really prefer that Seuss's own racism not be discussed. When I wrote the official biography for the Seussville website, I was asked to cut any mention of the stereotypes in the cartoons, even though my narrative tried to frame this in a positive way, noting that in his later work, Seuss actively opposed stereotypes, which he did, and also didn't. Since I wanted to be paid for the job, I cut that, although I have included that story in this book and right now in this talk. Seuss Enterprises' resistance exemplifies the problem. The failure to discuss their work honestly helped sustain racism in children's literature and culture. To borrow the words of Robin DiAngelo, who I'll come to again later in the talk, a continual retreat from the discomfort of authentic racial engagement results in a perpetual cycle that works to hold racism in place. And if we're ever to break that cycle, we need to experience that discomfort, to have those uncomfortable conversations. And this may seem counterintuitive, but I argue that actually racist classics of children's literature can help us initiate those uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Now, I completely understand why people would want to erase the racism from books for young people. Changing the offensive portions of Huck Finn, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Dr. Dolittle, Mary Poppins, and many other books, which is something that happens, by the way, in children's literature. Books get changed, get altered to try to clean them up. And this seems to offer us a way to keep a literary work available and accessible without inflicting harm upon young readers. And to be clear, racist texts can inflict real psychic damage on children of all races, but the child who is a member of the targeted group bears a much heavier burden than the child who is not. The racism in these books all but ensure that children who are and have historically been the targets of prejudice will suffer in ways that white children won't. So, the 1988 edition of Lofting's Dr. Dolittle removes all references to skin color, and Prince Bumpo no longer wishes to be white. The bird Polynesia instead tricks him through hypnosis. In 1973, Roald Dahl revised his own Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Instead of African pygmies, the Oompa Loompas become small white people from Loompaland. P.L. Travers rewrote the Bad Tuesday chapter of Mary Poppins twice, in 1967 to remove the dialect from the people that they meet as they travel around the world, and in 1981 to remove the people and replace them with animals. And quite famously, fairly recently, Alan Gribben's 2011 edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn replaces all instances of nigger with slave and all instances of Injun with Indian, and that is a lot of changes. Twain uses the N-word 219 times in Huckleberry Finn. And for this very reason, there is a very strong case to be made for removing racist books from grade school and high school curricula altogether. Julius Lester, for example, has said that he is grateful that among the many indignities inflicted on me in childhood, I escaped Huckleberry Finn. He adds that as a black parent, he sympathizes with those who want the book banned or at least removed from required reading lists in schools. In fact, we could develop his line of argument even further and argue that the best way to hasten the decline of a racist classic, and thus the racism that it may propagate, is just not to teach it at all, at any level. And that's a strong argument, and I respect that argument. I'm going to make a slightly different argument here, and that is that ignoring the symptoms does not cure the disease, and that it is more risky to ban the racist books outright or to use only the Bowdlerized editions. And for those who may not know the term, to Bowdlerize is to clean up an offensive text. The term comes from Thomas Bowdler, who did this to Shakespeare 200 years ago in creating the family Shakespeare, Shakespeare for children that would not, provide them inappropriate material. So rather than Bowdlerize, rather than edit these books, I think it's a less risky choice to teach them critically, helping students see the ways in which the books reinforce racism, and engaging in painful but I think necessary conversations. And this is why, just as popular characters like the Cat in the Hat, Mickey Mouse, and Bugs Bunny naturalize their own minstrel origins, so Bowdlerized versions of classic books normalize the racism that revisionists aspire to expunge. Attempts to erase racism from these books don't actually get rid of racist ideologies. They just make them more insidious. They make them less obvious, and thus more difficult to resist. So in the revised version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Oompa Loompas still happily acquiesce to being shipped to England in large packing cases, and they find life in a factory preferable to life in their native land. They still submit to enslavement happily. Similarly, removing references to skin color in Dr. Dolittle does not also remove colonialism. Dr. Dolittle remains an enlightened white European who goes to civilize the natives. In all cases, trying to remove the racism and colonialism just more subtly encodes the same racial and colonial messages. Cleaning up these texts just make those messages harder to spot and harder to oppose. So a better approach, I think, is to read the originals with children and, of course, in the context of other books that present racism and present colonialism critically. Here are 3 benefits of doing so. First, as Bridget Fielder noted, after I presented a version of this chapter at a conference, the decision to talk about racism is a position of privilege. I mention this because some people may question the wisdom of talking about racism with young children. But that is a question or a comment that comes from privilege, because since children of color face racism from their earliest days, the adults in their lives don't have the choice of whether to discuss racism with them. The subject will come up, and responsible adults will also bring it up in the hopes of improving the children's safety. Parents tell black children, especially their sons, only walk in the street with one boy at a time, because if it's 3 or more, you're a mob. That's how the police will see you. They tell them never to ask the police for help. They say don't run, or they'll shoot you. And if children of color are going to survive in America and in the larger world, they'll need to learn how to respond to racism. And discussing racism via the safer realm of children's books can prepare them to face it in the world beyond the classroom. Second, teaching racist children's books can help direct the anger of those readers who are racism's targets. If, when facing racist art, children do not learn how to express anger or where to direct their anger, they may be left only with a pain that they cannot articulate. Finding the appropriate target for one's anger is a vital survival skill. As Martha Nussbaum points out, submerged anger can emerge as depression. However, expressed anger can be vital for developing agency. As Nico Friedge notes, anger implies hope. Further, anger implies that fighting is meaningful. One is not reduced to mere passivity. And I am not arguing for tough love here. Suffering is not ennobling. I am arguing that children understand more than they can articulate, and that without the ability to name or diagnose what they've experienced, they risk, in the words of Mari J. Matsuda, internalizing the injury done them and being rendered silent in the face of continuing injury. And I must again stress here that racist novels must only be read in context. So to expose the illusion of kindly white slave-owning Uncle Silas and the kind but gullible Jim in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, readers might turn to realistic novels like Christopher Paul Curtis's Elijah of Buxton, where slavers are murderers and torturers, and where Canada, not America, is the land of the free. Or they might read To Be a Slave, Julius Lester's powerful collection of ex-slaves' narratives, where they'll learn of living quarters, quote, more fit for animals than human beings, mothers who killed their own children rather than allow them to be sold, and other ways that slaves resisted their white masters. And third, a critical examination of racist children's books while readers are still children may prevent youthful affection from curdling into adult nostalgia. Grown-ups' emotional relationships with the works of their childhood often clouds their perception. Fondness can deflect critical questions. In contrast, asking children questions about these books while they're children can create a different, more critically engaged, more uncomfortable relationship, because children's emotional relationships with these books are still developing, still open-ended. The need to read and to teach these books is an argument that I make with reluctance and sadness. All children should be granted a childhood free from the injuries of prejudice. However, since encounters with hate are sadly inevitable, literature can offer us a safer space for young people to explore the complex, the difficult, the painful emotions that racism elicits. Both shielding children from and exposing children to racist texts are bad choices. But failing to confront racism is far more dangerous than ignoring it. Indeed, learning how to respond to racism is especially important for children in Donald Trump's America, which has made overt racism more socially acceptable than it has been in decades. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center's 2016 study, The Trump Effect, over 2/3 of educators reported that young people in their schools, immigrants, children of immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, and other students of color, had expressed concern about what might happen to them or their families. And since the election, hate crimes and racist harassment in school grounds have only increased. The Trump candidacy and presidency has required all good teachers to discuss racism in the classroom. And it may surprise you, but these discussions can also take place where racism doesn't actually seem to be a core issue of the work, or where racial politics and race itself don't seem present. However, the stories in which race seems to disappear are often those where racism is embedded more subtly and more dangerously. So William Joyce's The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore is a case study of this phenomenon. It's an Oscar-winning animated short that became an electronic book app and a picture book, and it is an aesthetic marvel. It may be the only children's story that I know of that works equally brilliantly as a book, as an app, and as a film. It's also really, really white. And this is strange because Hurricane Katrina, a main inspiration for the story, killed nearly 2,000 people. And most of those people, as you probably know, were African Americans. Throughout New Orleans, African American victims outnumbered white victims by more than double, comprising 66% of the storm deaths, while whites made up only 31%. And the storm displaced many more people, but with the exception of a portrait of Duke Ellington hanging on the wall and glimpsed very briefly near the end of both app and film, there are otherwise no characters of color anywhere in the app, in the film, or the book. And the conspicuous racial absence in this story and in Joyce's body of work more generally highlight how structural racism works in children's literature. It tends to normalize whiteness. It tends to dwell in nostalgia and to exoticize, to demonize, or just to erase non-white people altogether. Morris Lesmore also represents technological innovation's propensity for distracting us from the racial assumptions that underwrite its success. Morris Lesmore's acclaim depends, in part, upon the way it makes race disappear beneath whiteness's invisibility cloak. Unacknowledged whiteness is the midwife to all ostensibly transcendent, timeless stories culturally unmarked white characters read as universal characters. And so in Joyce's work, the displaced people are all white. The white title character becomes caretaker and librarian of a beautiful library whose patrons are all white and whose books are all by white authors. So despite Morris Lesmore's declaration in both app and picture book that everyone's story matters, Joyce's own story emphatically disagrees. Even more troubling is that Joyce's larger body of work either omits people of color or includes them only as exotic secondary characters. So in Dinosaur Bob and the Family Lizardo, Jumbo, their bodyguard said nothing, is a running gag, recurring 3 times. Jumbo's only speech in the book is a smile on the final 2-page spread. His name, his costume, and his role as a servant to a white American family makes him an exotic other. And more troubling is Joyce's tendency to shade his villains in dark colors, such as the attacking army of dark elves in Santa Claus. In images that resemble 1930s magazine illustrations, Joyce's imaginative, nostalgic vision subtly reinscribes early 20th century ideologies of race while effacing a history underwritten by those same ideologies. And having said all that, I actually understand why nostalgia might inspire the fantastic flying books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. After the storm moved the New Orleans that Joyce knew from contemporary time into the receding tide of memory, it's actually not surprising that longing for the pre-Katrina city would find itself expressed in nostalgic reconstruction. Located where today dreams of forgotten yesterdays, nostalgia is itself a crossroads with paths leading to childhood, creativity, and sorrow, all of which are central concerns of Morris Lesmore and its creator. As Linda Hutchins suggests, ever since nostalgia shifted from a physical condition, it was originally a diagnosis for severe homesickness, to a psychological one, nostalgia has been yoked to childhood. In 1798, Immanuel Kant noticed of nostalgia sufferers. Hutchins tells us that people who did return home were usually disappointed because, in fact, they did not want to return to a place, but to a time of youth. So that the author of a children's story might revive earlier aesthetic motifs, possibly images encountered in his own childhood, not only resonates with Kant's insight, but also recalls the connections between creativity and nostalgia. So the problem is actually not that Joyce is nostalgic. The problem, I think, is his type of nostalgia. And to explain what I mean, I'm going to borrow Svetlana Boym's very useful distinction between different kinds of nostalgia. She distinguishes between restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia. And Joyce's work, I think, cloaks the former in the latter. As Boym writes, restorative nostalgia does not think of itself as nostalgia, but rather as truth and tradition. Reflective nostalgia dwells on the ambivalences of human longing and belonging, and does not shy away from the contradictions of modernity. Restorative nostalgia protects the absolute truth, while reflective nostalgia calls it into doubt. And visually, Morris Lesmore does resemble this reflective nostalgia, lingering on, to quote Boym here, ruins the patina of time and history in the dreams of another place and another time. However, ideologically, it seems to yearn for that trans-historical reconstruction characteristic of restorative nostalgia. It imagines a past where, in the midst of a pastoral idyll, a library's open door invites a white reader onto beautifully polished hardwood floors where he can peruse stacks of books by white authors and loan some of them to white readers. Now, to be clear, I don't think that William Joyce himself is consciously nostalgic for white supremacy. I've never met the man. He seems like a nice guy. Rather, I think that a memory steeped in a white supremacist culture, and we live in a white supremacist culture, cannot easily filter out the racist bits. I also think that because aesthetics are bound up in emotions, this type of restorative nostalgia cannot easily be repelled or refuted. When the imagination mingles racist imagery or racial erasures with a deep yearning for childhood, these strands become very difficult to disentangle. In other words, the unconscious racism of restorative nostalgia tends to resist analysis. Creators and audiences insist that because they are not personally racist, their affection for the work repudiates any allegation that it might contain even trace elements of racism. The absence of non-white characters, for example, often gets interpreted as evidence that the artist simply does not see race, and thus his character's whiteness is merely a mark of his objectivity. But whiteness's power derives from its ability to figure white people as ideologically neutral, as the human race, instead of as white, and works that ask us to read their population of exclusively white characters as merely normal, universal people assert white dominance via not just the erasure of non-white people, but the denial of race itself. So the absence of characters of color in Joyce's and other white creators' works, this is a case study here. Lots of people do this, not just William Joyce. But this absence of sympathetic characters of color perpetuates failures of the imagination. When children primarily consume culture that distorts or omits people like them, their psyches become damaged. The Nigerian-born contemporary novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has spoken eloquently of the effect that a childhood spent reading British and American children's books had on her. When she began writing her own stories at the age of 7, she tells us, "All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather. How lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we didn't talk about the weather because there was no need to." As she says, her young experience, quote, "shows how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children, because all I had read were books in which the characters were foreign. I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them. It had to be about things with which I could not personally identify." And so, she says, one unintended consequence was that, quote, "I did not know that people like me could exist in literature." And whether we call this process the danger of a single story or colonizing the imagination, it demonstrates that racial invisibility actually is as harmful as racial stereotyping. And such erasures are not limited to works with all white casts either. Publishers can even perform racial vanishing acts on books featuring characters of color. In the interest of time, I've cut this whitewashing chapter from the presentation today, but briefly, this is what it's about. Believing that books with a person of color on the cover will not sell, publishers will instead put a white face, or a silhouette, or an ambiguously raised face on the dust jacket of a book whose protagonist is not white. And this is important, because we do judge books by their covers. Those that render people of color invisible tell young people of color that their experiences are not important enough to read about. And young readers notice. So to address the problem of racism in children's literature, we have to change the way that it is produced. Right now, 89% of people employed in the publishing industry identify as white or Caucasian. Only 5% identify as Asian, 3% as Hispanic, and 1% as African American. And those numbers do not represent the population at large, and nor do the books that are published every year. Though half of US school-age students are children of color, only 14% of American children's books published in 2015 were about people of color, and then the number by people of color was even less, it was only 10%. And if you look more closely, you'll notice something else, that realism, historical novels, and nonfiction more generally tend to be the most popular genre categories. In American children's and young adult publishing, genre works as a kind of Jim Crow. It's a non-racial way of regulating the literary experiences of people of color. Where 50 years ago, people of color were almost entirely excluded from mainstream publishing, now they get to publish, but just in a few select neighborhoods, the borders of which can be mapped by genre. There are many examples of this. Walter D. Myers is one example, or as Melinda Lowe has noted, quote, there can be a zillion white authors who write whatever kind of book, but if one marginalized author exists who does it, that's enough, and you don't get a chance to do it. And there are countless stories like these, and until recently, these are what we've had. We've had these stories. We haven't really had data. But in February of 2015, the University of Wisconsin's Cooperative Children's Book Center, which does a fantastic job of tracking how many diverse books get published every year, for the first time posted a list of all the titles in its annual African American and American Indian categories for the books of that year. It didn't list titles in any other categories and hasn't done this since, but I read reviews of all the books, and in some cases the books themselves, counted which books fit in which genres. Of course, all books fit in more than one genre, so my percentages don't add up to 100. But these are the patterns of the 193 books in the African American list. About 34% are realism, 30% have a historical focus, and 10% are biographies. All the other genres crowd together in a much smaller space. Now, the fact that books in other genres do get published may prompt some to challenge the Jim Crow metaphor I'm invoking here. I mean, after all, if segregation meant separate water fountains and bathrooms and schools, then wouldn't publishing's version also mean that some areas would be whites only? That's a reasonable question, and I think the reason people ask that question is that the term segregation is something of a misnomer. In the Jim Crow South, segregation did not literally mean the separation of races. It instead was a way of regulating the spaces in which the races interacted. So African Americans shared the same spaces with white Americans, but they shared them unequally. As Karen Fields notes, Jim Crow on the railways offered an exemption for the Afro-American servant attending her mistress or the mistress's child. Comparably, African American authors and characters do find places in genres outside of history and realism, but only in a tokenistic way, kind of like that servant on the railway car, or the sole black friend on a TV sitcom. So in 2014, the presence of 4 dystopian novels doesn't really contradict the fact that dystopia is mostly closed to writers and characters of color. These exceptions not only prove the rule, but actually provide a kind of colorblind alibi for structural racism. Briefly, 4 reasons why diversifying genre is really important. First, the institutional emphasis on history has the unintended consequence of implying that progress in time correlates with progress towards justice. It subtly conveys the message that America's crimes happened in the past, that the present is better, and the future will be better still. So, for example, there are very few books about Ferguson, or the Black Lives Matter movement, the prison industrial complex, or racist profiling. So part of diversifying genre requires a richer selection of contemporary texts that address present crises. In other words, we don't need fewer realist and historical texts. We need more of everything else. And one reason, and this is a second reason for why we should diversify genre, is that a different genre offers a new perspective on the real. One risk of so much historical fiction and realism is that readers can get jaded with yet another realistic historical novel about the civil rights movement, say. But novels can explore history via any genre, via fantasy, via science fiction, dystopia, mystery, horror. And in speculative fictions, alternate histories illuminate unexamined facets of our own history. An African American dystopian novel shifts the narrative center of gravity, examining power from an angle that a Caucasian dystopian novel, which of course is also known as a dystopian novel, might neglect. Genre shifts perspective. It changes the way we understand and shakes us out of our habits of thought. Diversifying genre can liberate the imagination. When we publish, teach, or read Black or other diverse to dystopian novels, fantasy, or speculative fiction, we challenge the unspoken assumption that certain genres are mainly for white readers and white writers. White children should not be the only ones encouraged to see themselves on a quest in an imaginary world, grappling with technologies of the future, maybe some invented here, or inhabiting mythological tales, or banding together to resist a dystopian regime. We need diversity among genres in order to decolonize the imagination. And to foster literacy among all children, we need greater diversity within and among genres because, though a voracious reader as a child, the late Walter D. Myers recalled the moment as a teen when, noticing that there was something missing in his books, he began to turn away from reading. as he writes, quote, "As I discovered who I was, a black teenager in a white-dominated world, I saw that these characters, these lives, were not mine." Years later, James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues would bring Myers back to reading and ultimately lead him to an acclaimed and prolific career of writing books for young people. But Myers was exceptional. For many people, the moment they, and I'm quoting Myers here, lost the potential person they would become, which is such a powerful and sad idea. That moment that they lost that potential person begins a slide towards hopelessness from which they never fully recover. Obviously, in the fight for diverse books, focusing on genre or on really any of the areas I've talked about today is insufficient in and of itself. Structural racism is a many-headed hydra. I could have written many more chapters than the ones that I did. So in the book's conclusion, I offer a manifesto for anti-racist children's literature, and I'll end with a few highlights from that, and then we can go to questions, or people can continue their lunch, or whatever you'd like to do. So first, recognize that personal racism is unconscious and that systemic racism is typically invisible. In 1942, Dr. Seuss drew a cartoon that he called, "What This Country Needs is a Good Mental Insecticide." And the cartoon suggests that if we could just get our heads fumigated, racism would no longer afflict us. While I admire the optimism of Seuss's metaphor, racism is not a bug, it's a feature. Racism is not aberrant, it's ordinary. At the very time that Seuss drew this cartoon, he was creating other cartoons that stereotype people of Japanese descent, inadvertently revealing his own confusion about how racism actually works. Racism is what Raymond Williams would have called a structure of feeling, which involves meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt. And there's a lived and felt component to racialized thought, which unconsciously shapes our emotional responses, our daily interactions with others, and our general experience of the world. So in any area of life where emotions inform behavior, racial structures of feeling play a role. In children's book publishing, this could be when evaluating books for young readers. Is a character sympathetic or not sympathetic? Is a novel realistic or is it not realistic? Does the book have aesthetic merit or not? Is the manuscript marketable or not marketable? Second, don't just teach tolerance, actually respect difference. As Karen Fields and Barbara Fields write, the word tolerance is a well-meaning misnomer. As they note, tolerance's shallowness as a moral or ethical precept is plain. Tolerate thy neighbor as thyself is not quite what Jesus said. Instead of tolerating difference, we should instead respect difference by first acknowledging that it's real. And then second, we should recognize that we have difference in common. And our differences are really interesting. We can learn from each other if we listen to and respect different experiences. Be aware of the limits of empathy. And this is a kind of a white person advice for this particular one. White people's well-meaning attempts to feel non-white people's pain often fall short and can actually be harmful. So in the field of children's literature, educators like myself, publishers, consumers, must do more than just sympathize with underrepresented groups. All of us should instead ask, how is my action or inaction causing pain? How am I responsible? What can I do? For people who are teachers, do you have just a token Latina novel on your syllabus, or do you have many? If you're a publisher, are all of your black children's books realism, historical fiction, memoir? Mark whiteness. If while reading we encounter a character whose race is not named, we just assume whiteness. But we can take away whiteness's unmarked power by naming it. So for writers who tend to only assign race or ethnicity to non-white characters, you can change that. If you identify a Native American third grader or a black teacher, you should also identify the white football coach, the white bus driver, the white guidance counselor. And in the fall of 2015, Kirkus Reviews actually started doing this. They actually started identifying the race of everybody. This is another one specifically for white people, and that is that white people, all of us, must recognize our complicity in white supremacy and use our privilege to fight it. To quote Robin DiAngelo again, white racism is ultimately a white problem, and the burden for interrupting it belongs to white people. That's partly why I wrote this book. All white people need to acknowledge that you do not have to actively support white supremacy in order to benefit from white supremacy. All white people benefit from white supremacy, whether we want to or not. And as beneficiaries, we are also unwitting accomplices. Fortunately, though unfairly, our unearned privilege grants us a more receptive audience with those whites who remain unconvinced. So we have a moral obligation to use white privilege to undermine white supremacy. Obviously, buy diverse books, and remember, children of all races need diverse books. Teach diverse books, publish diverse books. Publishers need to meet the needs of a population that's growing more racially diverse, and not just because this is the right thing to do, although it is, but because failing to respond risks engineering their own irrelevance. By 2043, the US population will be majority non-white, and if deterred by books that ignore or stereotype them, non-white children learn to read in lesser numbers or come to understand that reading is not for them, then they're less likely to grow into adults who read and therefore buy books. And finally, it's the responsibility of everybody, not just authors, writers, educators, parents of color, but everybody, to support these efforts. And we can do this by being allies, by being advocates, by supporting those working to bring diverse books to children, by buying them for our libraries, teaching them in classes, giving them to the young people in our lives. Racism is resilient, adaptable, and thriving, as indicated by the continuing popularity of white supremacist leaders, obviously Donald Trump here in the US, Marine Le Pen in France, who did lose the recent election, but still received 34% of the vote, or twice what her father received 15 years ago. The best place to fight racism is in children's literature and children's culture, and we need to help nurture a new generation that is less susceptible to the follies of bigotry and the many wounds it inflicts. Thanks for coming out, and I'm glad to take questions, or not, as you wish. So thank you.
I grew up watching Looney Tunes, and you know, on Saturday mornings, my dad eventually, he liked to do a lot of like the voice acting and stuff.
Yeah.
Eventually, we got the DVDs so that we could watch them all the time. And I don't know if you're familiar, but Whoopi Goldberg did a little disclaimer in front of before the DVDs to say that this was a different time when these cartoons were, you know, popular, and that there was a lot of, you know, hidden racism in there as well.
Yeah.
From your standpoint, is that that disclaimer, is that on the right track to kind of presenting the discussion? And because I know a lot of people are like, oh, she didn't need to do that. But
I think she did need to do that, and I think she could go even further, because the racism of the past continues to influence the present. So people watching those cartoons now are getting those same messages. And then the other reason I think you could go further is that, you know, a common argument that's made is, well, people thought differently then than they do now, and so we can't judge them by the same standards that we judge people now by. But here's the thing. The range of available opinions does not change. What changes over time is the distribution of those opinions. There were people at the time those Warner Brothers cartoons were made who saw the stereotypes as bad. Now, they weren't creating the Warner Brothers cartoons. But I think the danger of that is it has a tendency to excuse the racism of the past, and not everybody thought that way. I'm going to guess, for example, that a person who saw him or herself caricatured in 1942 or 1953 might feel a little differently than, say, a white creator creating that person. I'm just going to hazard a guess. So I think Whoopi Goldberg's disclaimer is important to include. I'd go further. I'd go further, because I think you want to keep this art alive and out there, but I also think we need a complicated relationship to it. And I think it's hard for people to, especially for things they saw as children, to develop that, because you have affection for it. It was fun watching those. Mal Blanc was great, you know, and culture that is beautiful, that is enjoyable, that is marvelous in many ways, can also be damaging. And I think people need to have those coexisting in their minds. And I know that's hard. And I think I have maybe exceeded the length of my answer here and gone on too long. So I'll stop.
How could she go further?
I think she could go further by including some resources on there beyond the introduction. I mean, if it's a DVD, that's an ideal format for, let's say, annotating it. You know, you could have, just as you do for films, you know, commentary tracks. You could have commentary tracks that work to educate and not just simply say how wonderful this was and how much I enjoyed writing it. The media we have available today offers so many more possibilities for education. So the introduction could do that. It could say, and I invite you to listen to this audio track where we talk about, why you might want to watch this with questions and not with simply applause. So, but yeah, that's a great example, and I'm glad you raised it. So thanks, and thanks for coming, everybody. It's very nice of you.
Thank you.
So it seems like this is sort of an interesting and provocative question you started off with, and I'm curious how children answer it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there work, to some extent, like whether or not this is a problem is dependent on how the children who are reading these books react.
Right.
Is there work and studies you've done about like whether different races identify more or less strongly with like the Cat in the Hat? Or is this something that really we're just looking back and seeing and analyzing? Like, is that a thing you can study, and have you done so?
No, I think that's an excellent question. And as you know, the answer to that's an excellent question is the way of the speaker hedging. And so I am hedging. And then now I will offer an imperfect answer to your excellent question, which is that's the central question of a lot of children's literature scholarship. What do the children think? And it's tricky to answer for a variety of reasons. First of all, you actually have to do the research and go interview individual children, because individual children are all different and all respond differently, and it's as impossible to generalize about children as it is to generalize about adults. And I have not done that specific research on this. I have done the research on the texts themselves, but I haven't done the research on the children. And I mean, anecdotally, I can tell you things, of people who, when I've talked about the Cat in the Hat's minstrel ancestry, have come up and said, gosh, he always disturbed me, and I think I can now identify why. Even from when I was a child, this character disturbed me. That's anecdotal. It's not quantitative. I don't think it would pass muster for those of you working at a major technology company. I'm just going to guess. But that's also part of the reason for writing the book, is that there are a lot of ways in which these things are hidden and unexplored. You could write 100 chapters on this. I just wrote 5, but I think a 6th chapter should be some kind of quantitative study, which I did not do. There are other studies you could cite, like on children's responses to black dolls, for example. There are famous studies on those that in which the children, even black children, prefer the white doll to the black doll, and those stories have been cited as evidence that they learned racism. Another way to read those is that they've learned which characters get to do interesting things, and it's not the black character, it's the white character. But either way, it's an example of how those attitudes persist in children's minds. So there have been studies done. I have not done a specific study on the Cat in the Hat, but it's a great idea, and I think it would we'd learn a lot from it, and the Seuss people would not be happy. But yeah, it's a good question. So yeah.
All right. Well, let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Phillip now. Thank you for coming.